So there are a number of really important philosophical and theological questions about worship. Some of them are about the nature of worship, about what exactly it is to worship some being, worship God in particular. Some of the questions, however, are what we might call normative questions. They're questions about what reason we have to obey God, to worship God, or why we ought to worship God, or why God is worship worthy. Right? So the questions that I'm concerned with within this project are normative questions, being the second sort of question about God. Now, there have been in recent philosophy and recent theology very, very hard questions pressed about whether we can really articulate well the grounds that we have for worshiping God, that is the normative basis for why we ought to give God worship. One way this question has been pressed is whether or not worship is the kind of things that we free beings ought to give to some other being at all, right? Whether or not we, as beings that should make up our own minds or make our own decisions, should really subject ourselves wholly to anyone else, including God. More recently, the question has been pressed whether we can give an account of the obligation to obey God, that is, why it is that we're under some sort of requirement to subject ourselves in the way that worship requires. I myself am not suspicious on these grounds. I think it's not so hard to explain why we ought to obey God in this way. If really God is an absolutely great being in the way that God's supposed to be, then it's not surprising at all that we should have the kinds of attitudes that seem to be part and parcel of worship, that we should be awed by God, should revere God, and so forth. It strikes me as something that would be in a way irrational or unreasonable if our attitudes weren't attuned to the greatness of God in that way. Similarly, if we think of worship as being a set of actions as well as a set of attitudes, it seems like someone who has the right kind of attitudes with respect to God or with respect to anything will in some way express those attitudes in some way. We express our admiration by giving praise, we express our fear by cowering, we express our sadness by wearing black or taking ourselves out of the ordinary routine of our lives. So it strikes me that we don't have much of difficulty explaining sort of the rationality, the very, very strong rationality of worship. What strikes me, though, is that there's a different kind of normative question about worship that really needs to be addressed that I think is different from this question about whether we ought to worship God. I think there's a different question. It's whether we owe God worship. Okay, so that might strike you as sort of a nitpicky distinction, but I think it's a very, very important distinction. We often talk about what we ought to do for someone, whether we ought to treat someone a certain way, without thinking that we owe it to them, right? So if I make a promise to you to give your mother, take your mother out to lunch, and I don't take your mother out to lunch, I don't owe your mother lunch. I owe you taking your mother out to lunch. So just because I ought to treat your mother a certain way doesn't mean that I owe it to her, right? And if even if there's some beautiful painting, right, that I ought to respect or that I ought to admire, if I fail to do that, I haven't violated something that I owe to the painting. Okay, I don't owe the painting anything. The painting is the wrong kind of thing to owe anything to. So my question is whether it's true that we owe God worship, right? Is it really the case that we owe God worship in the way that I owe you something if I've made you a promise, or I owe my fellow human being certain kinds of respect and attention? Right? Now, you might think, oh, that's easy. It's sort of obvious that we owe God worship, that we owe God lots of things. But it strikes me as actually a much more puzzling and difficult question, right? And for various reasons, I'll just sort of give a few of them. So one sort of reason one might have for thinking that we don't owe God worship is that at least not by nature anyway, and sort of naturally or necessarily, is that the typical context of owing things is within law and other human social practices. And once we transport the question of worship away from something very, very human practice bound into something like a necessary relationship between God and creature, it seems sort of surprising to me that we would assume that that kind of normative relationship, owing, would be transferred over by nature and necessarily into the context of creatures and God. The second thing, and this is the one that I would place more emphasis on, is sort of what you might think of as conditions for one party to owe another party something, right? So the basic idea would be something like this, that when one party owes something else something, they must be under a common normative framework, right? So if I make a contract with you right? And so I come to owe you something as a result. It's really crucial that we're both bound by a common normative framework, like the same legal framework that gives legal force, right, to the terms that we've made. That's what makes it the case that I owe it to you, okay? That you and I are bound together by the terms of our contract. Well, if that's right, if owing requires this, there being like a common normative framework, I think that we have some reasons to be suspicious about the idea that we owe God worship by nature. In order for that to be true on this view, it would have to be the case that God and I, by nature, then God and you by nature, God and every rational creature by nature, share a common normative framework. And that strikes me as something about which we ought to be very, very suspicious. If it's true that what makes us bound by a set of moral norms and norms of justice and so forth is our common human nature, and we by nature don't share a nature with God, then it wouldn't be the case that God and I are under, and you and God are under a common and normative framework, and so that we could by nature owe things to God. So that's my reason for worry about this. It's not clear to me that we owe God worship by nature. Does that mean we don't owe God worship at all? I don't think that's true either. I think that owing God worship is not something that holds by nature, but is rather a kind of achievement, all right? Rather that in order for us to owe God by nature, it has to be the case that God has chosen to enter into a common normative relationship with us, right? To take on a special kind of relationship with us that wouldn't hold naturally simply in virtue of God's creating us. And, in fact, so I might, the skeptical thoughts I expressed before about worship, you might think are kind of a bummer or kind of sad. But actually, I think it's I'm kind of heartened by this idea that our coming to owe God something like worship is a way of entering into a special relationship with God. And I don't think this is foreign to our human experience. I think that when we think about the way that families come to be bound by each other by marriage, or that an adult can come to be bound by a child through adoption, and these bonds of owing are a kind of intimate relationship, right? And given the fact that coming into relationship with God is in a way a kind of achievement and kind of a struggle, it's wonderful that there's one more way, that of owing, that we can come into relationship and be bound to God.